the poor relation's story, he was very reluctant to take precedence of so many respected members of the family by beginning the round of stories they were to relate as they sat in a goodly circle by the Christmas fire, and he modestly suggested that it would be more correct if John, our esteemed host, whose health he begged to drink, would have the kindness to begin. For as to himself, he said, he was so little used to lead the way that really, but as they all cried out here that he must begin, and agreed with one voice that he might, could, would, and should begin, he left off rubbing his hands, and took his legs out from under his armchair, and did begin. "I have no doubt," said the poor relation, "that I shall surprise the assembled members of our family, and particularly John, our esteemed host, to whom we are so much indebted for the great hospitality with which he has this day entertained us, by the confession I am going to make. But if you do me the honour to be surprised at anything that falls from a person so unimportant in the family as I am, I can only say that I shall be scrupulously accurate in all I relate. I am not what I am supposed to be. I am quite another thing. Perhaps before I go further I had better glance at what I am supposed to be. It is supposed, unless I mistake, the assembled members of our family will correct me if I do, which is very likely," here the poor relation looked mildly about him for contradiction, "that I am nobody's enemy but my own, that I never met with any particular success in anything, that I failed in business because I was unbusinesslike and credulous, in not being prepared for the interested designs of my partner, that I failed in love because I was ridiculously trustful in thinking it impossible that Christiana could deceive me, that I failed in my expectations from my Uncle Chill, on account of not being as sharp as he could have wished in worldly matters, that through life I have been rather put upon and disappointed in a general way, that I am at present a bachelor of between 59 and 60 years of age, living on a limited income in the form of a quarterly allowance, to which I see that John, our esteemed host, wishes me to make no further allusion. The supposition as to my present pursuits and habits is to the following effect. I live in a lodging in the Clapham Road, a very clean back room in a very respectable house, where I am expected not to be at home in the daytime unless poorly, and which I usually leave in the morning at 9 o'clock, on pretence of going to business. I take my breakfast, my roll and butter, and my half pint of coffee, at the old established coffee shop near Westminster Bridge, and then I go into the city, I don't know why, and sit in Garraway's coffee house, and on 'Change, and walk about, and look into a few offices and counting houses where some of my relations or acquaintance are so good as to tolerate me, and where I stand by the fire if the weather happens to be cold. I get through the day in this way until 5 o'clock, and then I dine, at a cost on the average of 1 and 3 pence. Having still a little money to spend on my evening's entertainment, I look into the old established coffee shop as I go home, and take my cup of tea, and perhaps my bit of toast. So, as the large hand of the clock makes its way round to the morning hour again, I make my way round to the Clapham Road again, and go to bed when I get to my lodging, fire being expensive, and being objected to by the family on account of its giving trouble and making a dirt. Sometimes one of my relations or acquaintances is so obliging as to ask me to dinner. Those are holiday occasions, and then I generally walk in the park. I am a solitary man, and seldom walk with anybody. Not that I am avoided because I am shabby, for I am not at all shabby, having always a very good suit of black on, or rather Oxford mixture, which has the appearance of black and wears much better. But I have got into a habit of speaking low, and being rather silent, and my spirits are not high, and I am sensible that I am not an attractive companion. The only exception to this general rule is the child of my first cousin, little Frank. I have a particular affection for that child, and he takes very kindly to me. He is a diffident boy by nature, and in a crowd he is soon run over, as I may say, and forgotten. He and I, however, get on exceedingly well. I have a fancy that the poor child will in time succeed to my peculiar position in the family. We talk but little, still we understand each other. We walk about hand in hand, and without much speaking he knows what I mean, and I know what he means. When he was very little indeed, I used to take him to the windows of the toy shop and show him the toys inside. It is surprising how soon he found out that I would have made him a great many presents if I had been in circumstances to do it. Little Frank and I go and look at the outside of the monument. He is very fond of the monument, and at the bridges, and at all the sights that are free. On 2 of my birthdays we have dined on à la mode beef, and gone at half price to the play, and been deeply interested. I was once walking with him in Lombard Street, which we often visit on account of my having mentioned to him that there are great riches there. He is very fond of Lombard Street, when a gentleman said to me as he passed by, "Sir, your little son has dropped his glove." I assure you, if you will excuse my remarking on so trivial a circumstance, this accidental mention of the child as mine quite touched my heart and brought the foolish tears into my eyes. When little Frank is sent to school in the country, I shall be very much at a loss what to do with myself, but I have the intention of walking down there once a month and seeing him on a half holiday. I am told he will then be at play upon the heath, and if my visits should be objected to as unsettling the child, I can see him from a distance without his seeing me, and walk back again. His mother comes of a highly genteel family, and rather disapproves. I am aware of our being too much together. I know that I am not calculated to improve his retiring disposition, but I think he would miss me beyond the feeling of the moment if we were wholly separated. When I die in the Clapham Road, I shall not leave much more in this world than I shall take out of it. I happen to have a miniature of a bright-faced boy with a curling head, and an open shirt frill waving down his bosom. My mother had it taken for me, but I can't believe that it was ever like, and which I shall beg may be given to Frank. I have written my dear boy a little letter with it, in which I have told him that I felt very sorry to part from him, though bound to confess that I knew no reason why I should remain here. I have given him some short advice, the best in my power, to take warning of the consequences of being nobody's enemy but his own, and I have endeavoured to comfort him for what I fear he will consider a bereavement, by pointing out to him that I was only a superfluous something to every one but him, and that having by some means failed to find a place in this great assembly, I am better out of it. Such, said the poor relation, clearing his throat and beginning to speak a little louder, is the general impression about me. Now, it is a remarkable circumstance which forms the aim and purpose of my story, that this is all wrong. This is not my life, and these are not my habits. I do not even live in the Clapham Road. Comparatively speaking, I am very seldom there. I reside mostly in a— I'm almost ashamed to say the word, it sounds so full of pretension— in a castle. I do not mean that it is an old baronial habitation, but still it is a building always known to everyone by the name of a castle. In it I preserve the particulars of my history. They run thus. It was when I first took John Spatter, who had been my clerk, into partnership, and when I was still a young man of not more than 25, residing in the house of my Uncle Chill, from whom I had considerable expectations, that I ventured to propose to Christiana. I had loved Christiana a long time. She was very beautiful, and very winning in all respects. I rather mistrusted her widowed mother, who I feared was of a plotting and mercenary turn of mind, but I thought as well of her as I could for Christiana's sake. I never had loved any one but Christiana, and she had been all the world, and oh, far more than all the world to me from our childhood. Christiana accepted me with her mother's consent, and I was rendered very happy indeed. My life at my Uncle Chill's was of a spare, dull kind, and my garret chamber was as dull and bare and cold as an upper prison room in some stern northern fortress. But having Christiana's love, I wanted nothing upon earth. I would not have changed my lot with any human being. Avarice was unhappily my Uncle Chill's master vice. Though he was rich, he pinched and scraped and clutched and lived miserably. As Christiana had no fortune, I was for some time a little fearful of confessing our engagement to him, but at length I wrote him a letter, saying how it all truly was. I put it into his hand one night on going to bed. As I came downstairs next morning, shivering in the cold December air, colder in my uncle's unwarmed house than in the street, where the winter sun did sometimes shine, and which was at all events enlivened by cheerful faces and voices passing along. I carried a heavy heart towards the long, low breakfast room in which my uncle sat. It was a large room with a small fire, and there was a great bay window in it which the rain had marked in the night, as if with the tears of houseless people. It stared upon a raw yard with a cracked stone pavement, and some rusted iron railings half uprooted, whence an ugly outbuilding that had once been a dissecting room, in the time of the great surgeon who had mortgaged the house to my uncle, stared at it. We rose so early always, that at that time of the year we breakfasted by candlelight. When I went into the room, my uncle was so contracted by the cold, and so huddled together in his chair behind the one dim candle, that I did not see him until I was close to the table. As I held out my hand to him, he caught up his stick. Being infirm, he always walked about the house with a stick, and made a blow at me and said, "You fool!" "Uncle," I returned, "I didn't expect you to be so angry as this." Nor had I expected it, though he was a hard and angry old man. "You didn't expect," said he. "When did you ever expect? When did you ever calculate, or look forward, you contemptible dog?" "These are hard words, uncle." "Hard words? Feathers, to pelt such an idiot as you with," said he. "Here, Betsy Snap, look at him." Betsy Snap was a withered, hard-favoured, yellow old woman, our only domestic, always employed at this time of the morning in rubbing my uncle's legs. As my uncle adjured her to look at me, he put his lean grip on the crown of her head, she kneeling beside him, and turned her face towards me. An involuntary thought connecting them both with the dissecting room, as it must often have been in the surgeon's time, passed across my mind in the midst of my anxiety. "Look at the snivelling milksop," said my uncle. "Look at the baby. This is the gentleman who people say is nobody's enemy but his own. This is the gentleman who can't say no. This is the gentleman who was making such large profits in his business that he must needs take a partner t'other day. This is the gentleman who's going to marry a wife without a penny, and who falls into the hands of Jezebels who are speculating on my death." I knew now how great my uncle's rage was, for nothing short of his being almost beside himself would have induced him to utter that concluding word, which he held in such repugnance that it was never spoken or hinted at before him on any account. "On my death," he repeated, as if he were defying me by defying his own abhorrence of the word. "On my death, death, death! But I'll spoil the speculation. Eat your last under this roof, you feeble wretch, and may it choke you." You may suppose that I had not much appetite for the breakfast to which I was bidden in these terms, but I took my accustomed seat. I saw that I was repudiated henceforth by my uncle. Still I could bear that very well, possessing Christiana's heart. He emptied his basin of bread and milk as usual, only that he took it on his knees with his chair turned away from the table where I sat. When he had done, he carefully snuffed out the candle, and the cold, slate-coloured, miserable day looked in upon us. "Now, Mr. Michael," said he, "before we part, I should like to have a word with these ladies in your presence." "As you will, sir," I returned, "but you deceive yourself and wrong us cruelly if you suppose that there is any feeling at stake in this contract but pure, disinterested, faithful love." To this he only replied, "You lie," and not one other word. We went through half-thawed snow and half-frozen rain to the house where Christiana and her mother lived. My uncle knew them very well. They were sitting at their breakfast, and were surprised to see us at that hour. "Your servant, ma'am," said my uncle to the mother. "You divine the purpose of my visit, I dare say, ma'am. I understand there is a world of pure, disinterested, faithful love cooped up here. I am happy to bring it all at once, to make it complete. I bring you your son-in-law, ma'am, and you, your husband, miss. The gentleman is a perfect stranger to me, but I wish him joy of his wise bargain. He snarled at me as he went out, and I never saw him again." "It is altogether a mistake," continued the poor relation, To suppose that my dear Christiana, over-persuaded and influenced by her mother, married a rich man, the dirt from whose carriage wheels is often, in these changed times, thrown upon me as she rides by. No, no, she married me. The way we came to be married rather sooner than we intended was this. I took a frugal lodging, and was saving and planning for her sake, when one day she spoke to me with great earnestness, and said, "My dear Michael, I have given you my heart. I have said that I loved you, and I have pledged myself to be your wife. I am as much yours through all changes of good and evil, as if we had been married on the day when such words passed between us. I know you well, and know that if we should be separated and our union broken off, your whole life would be shadowed, and all that might, even now, be stronger in your character for the conflict with the world, would then be weakened to the shadow of what it is." "God help me, Christiana," said I, "you speak the truth." "Michael," she said, putting her hand in mine, in all maidenly devotion, "let us keep apart no longer. It is but for me to say that I can live contented upon such means as you have, and I well know you are happy. I say so from my heart. Strive no more alone, let us strive together. My dear Michael, it is not right that I should keep secret from you what you do not suspect, but what distresses my whole life. My mother, without considering that what you have lost for me, and on the assurance of my faith, sets her heart on riches, and urges another suit upon me, to my misery. I cannot bear this, for to bear it is to be untrue to you. I would rather share your struggles than look on. I want no better home than you can give me. I know that you will aspire and labour with a higher courage if I am wholly yours, and let it be so when you will. I was blessed indeed that day, and a new world opened to me. We were married in a very little while, and I took my wife to our happy home. That was the beginning of the residence I have spoken of. The castle we have ever since inhabited together dates from that time. All our children have been born in it. Our first child, now married, was a little girl, whom we called Christiana. Her son is so like little Frank that I hardly know which is which. The current impression as to my partner's dealings with me is also quite erroneous. He did not begin to treat me coldly, as a poor simpleton, when my uncle and I so fatally quarrelled, nor did he afterwards gradually possess himself of our business and edge me out. On the contrary, he behaved to me with the utmost good faith and honour. Matters between us took this turn. On the day of my separation from my uncle, and even before the arrival at our counting-house of my trunks, which he sent after me, not carriage paid, I went down to our room of business on our little wharf, overlooking the river, and there I told John Spatter what had happened. John did not say in reply that rich old relatives were palpable facts, and that love and sentiment were moonshine and fiction. He addressed me thus: "Michael," said John, "we were at school together, and I generally had the knack of getting on better than you, and making a higher reputation." "You had, John," I returned. "Although," said John, "I borrowed your books and lost them, borrowed your pocket money and never repaid it, got you to buy my damaged knives at a higher price than I had given for them new, and to own to the windows that I had broken." "All not worth mentioning, John Spatter," said I, "but certainly true." "When you were first established in this infant business, which promises to thrive so well," pursued John, "I came to you in my search for almost any employment, and you made me your clerk." "Still not worth mentioning, my dear John Spatter," said I, "still equally true." "And finding that I had a good head for business, and that I was really useful to the business, you did not like to retain me in that capacity, and thought it an act of justice soon to make me your partner." "Still less worth mentioning than any of those other little circumstances you have recalled, John Spatter," said I, "for I was, and am, sensible of your merits and my deficiencies." "Now, my good friend," said John, drawing my arm through his, as he had had a habit of doing at school, while two vessels outside the windows of our counting-house, which were shaped like the stern windows of a ship, went lightly down the river with the tide, as John and I might then be sailing away in company, and in trust and confidence on our voyage of life. Let there, under these friendly circumstances, be a right understanding between us. You are too easy, Michael. You are nobody's enemy but your own. If I were to give you that damaging character among our connection," with a shrug and a shake of the head and a sigh, "and if I were further to abuse the trust you place in me—" "But you never will abuse it at all, John," I observed. "Never," he said. "Never," said he. "But I am putting a case. I say, and if I were further to abuse that trust by keeping this piece of our common affairs in the dark, and this other piece in the light, and again this other piece in the twilight, and so on, I should strengthen my strength and weaken your weaknesses day by day, until at last I found myself on the high road to fortune, and you left behind on some bare common, a hopeless number of miles out of the way." "Exactly so," said I. "To prevent this, Michael," said John Spatter, "or the remotest chance of this, there must be perfect openness between us. Nothing must be concealed, and we must have but one interest." "My dear John Spatter," I assured him, "that is precisely what I mean." "And when you are too easy," pursued John, his face glowing with friendship, "you must allow me to prevent that imperfection in your nature from being taken advantage of by any one. You must not expect me to humour it." "My dear John Spatter," I interrupted, "I don't expect you to humour it. I want to correct it." "And I too," said John. "Exactly so," cried I. "We both have the same end in view, and honourably seeking it, and fully trusting one another, and having but one interest, ours will be a prosperous and happy partnership." "I am sure of it," returned John Spatter, and we shook hands most affectionately. I took John home to my castle, and we had a very happy day. Our partnership throve well. My friend and partner supplied what I wanted, as I had foreseen that he would, and by improving both the business and myself, amply acknowledged any little rise in life to which I had helped him. "I am not," said the poor relation, looking at the fire as he slowly rubbed his hands, "very rich, for I never cared to be that, but I have enough, and I am above all moderate wants and anxieties. My castle is not a splendid place, but it is very comfortable, and it has a warm and cheerful air, and is quite a picture of home. Our eldest girl, who is very like her mother, married John Spatter's eldest son. Our two families are closely united in other ties of attachment. It is very pleasant of an evening, when we are all assembled together, which frequently happens, and when John and I talk over old times, and the one interest there has always been between us. I really do not know, in my castle, what loneliness is. Some of our children or grandchildren are always about it, and the young voices of my descendants are delightful. Oh, how delightful to me to hear! My dearest and most devoted wife, ever faithful, ever loving, ever helpful and sustaining and consoling, is the priceless blessing of my house, from whom all its other blessings spring. We are rather a musical family, and when Christiana sees me at any time a little weary or depressed, she steals to the piano and sings a gentle air she used to sing when we were first betrothed. So weak a man am I that I cannot bear to hear it from any other source. They played it once at the theatre, when I was there with little Frank, and the child said, wondering, "Cousin Michael, whose hot tears are these that have fallen on my hand?" Such is my castle, and such are the real particulars of my life therein preserved. I often take little Frank home there. He is very welcome to my grandchildren, and they play together. At this time of year, the Christmas and New Year time, I am seldom out of my castle, for the associations of the season seem to hold me there, and the precepts of the season seem to teach me that it is well to be there. "And the castle is—" observed a grave, kind voice among the company. "Yes, my castle," said the poor relation, shaking his head as he still looked at the fire, "is in the air. John, our esteemed host, suggests its situation accurately. My castle is in the air. I have done. Will you be so good as to pass the story?"
The Ghost of the late Mr. James Barber. Luck! Nonsense! There is no such thing. Life is not a game of chance any more than chess is. If you lose, you have no one but yourself to blame. This was said by a young lieutenant in the Royal Navy to a middle-aged midshipman, his elder brother. Do you mean to say that luck had nothing to do with fine gentleman Bobbin passing for lieutenant and my being turned back? Was the rejoinder. Bobbin, though a dandy, is a good seaman, and... The speaker looked another way, and hesitated. I am not, you would add, if you had courage. But I say I am, and a better seaman than Bobbin. Practically, perhaps, for you were 10 years older in the service, but it was in the theoretical part of seamanship, which is equally important, that you broke down before the examiners, continued the younger officer, in tones of earnest but sorrowful reproach. You never would study. I'll tell you what it is, Master Ferdinand, said the elder middy, not without a show of displeasure. I don't think this is the correct sort of conversation to be going on between two brothers after a 5 years' separation. The young lieutenant laid his hand soothingly on his brother's arm, and entreated him to take what he said in good part. Well, well, rejoined the middy, with a laugh half forced. Take care what you are about, or by Jove I'll inform against you. What for? Why, for preaching without a licence. Besides, you were once as bad as you pretend I am. I own it with sorrow, but I was warned in time by the wretched end of poor James Barber. Of whom? Asked the elder brother, starting back as he pushed his glass along the table. You don't mean Jovial Jemmy, as we used to call him? Once my messmate in the brig Rollock? Yes, I do. What, dead? Yes. Why, it was one of our great delights, when in harbour and on shore, to go the rounds, as he called it, with Jovial Jemmy. He understood life from stem to stern, from truck to keel. He knew everybody, from the First Lord downwards. I have seen him recognised by the Duke one minute, and the next pick up with a strolling player, and familiarly treat him at a tavern. He once took me to a quadrille party at the Duchess of Durrington's, where he seemed to know and be known to everybody present, and then adjourned to the cider cellars, where he was equally intimate with all sorts of queer characters. Though a favourite among the aristocracy, he was equally welcome to less exclusive societies. He was brother, past master, warden, noble grand, or president of all sorts of lodges and fraternities. Uncommonly knowing was Jemmy, in all sorts of club and fashionable gossip. He knew who gave the best dinners, and was always invited to the best balls. He was a capital judge of champagne, and when he betted upon a horse race, everybody backed him. He could hum all the fashionable songs, and was the 4th man who could dance the polka when it was first imported. Then he was as profound in bottled stout, Welsh rabbits, Burton ale, devilled kidneys, and bowls of bishop, as he was in Roman punch, French cookery, and Italian singers. Afloat, he was the soul of fun. He got up all our private theatricals, told all the best stories, and sung comic songs that made even the purser laugh. An extent and variety of knowledge and accomplishments, said Lieutenant Fid, which had the precise effect of blasting his prospects in life. He was, as you remember, at last dismissed the service, for intemperance and incompetence. When did you see him last? What, alive? Inquired Ferdinand Fid, changing countenance. Of course. Surely you do not mean to insinuate that you have seen his ghost? The lieutenant was silent, and the midshipman took a deep draught of his favourite mixture, equal portions of rum and water, and hinted to his younger brother, the lieutenant, the expediency of immediately confiding the story to the marines, for he declined to credit it. He then ventured another recommendation, which was that Ferdinand should throw the impotent temperance tipple he was then imbibing over the side of the ship, which meant the tavern of that name in Greenwich, at the open bow window of which they were then sitting, and clear his intellects by something stronger. I can afford to be laughed at, said the younger Fid, because I have gained immeasurably by the delusion, if it be one. But if ever there was a ghost, I have seen the ghost of James Barber. I, like yourself and he, was nearly ruined by love of amusement and intemperance, when he, or whatever else it might have been, came to my aid. Let us hear. I see I am in for a ghost story. Well, it was 1841 when I came home in the Arrow, with dispatches from the coast of Africa. You were lying in the Tagus in the bobstay. Ours, you know, was rather a thirsty station. A man inclined for it comes home from the slaving coasts with a determination to make up his lee way. I did mine with a vengeance. As usual, I looked up Jovial Jemmy. 'Twas easy to find him if you knew where to go. I did know, and went. He had by that time got tired of his more aristocratic friends, Respectability was too slow for him, so I found him presiding over the philanthropic raspers at the Union Jack. He received me with open arms, and took me, as you say, the rounds. I can't recall that week's dissipation without a shudder. We rushed about from bowl to tavern, from theatre to supper-room, from club to gin palace, as if our lives depended on losing not a moment. We had not time to walk, so we galloped about in cabs. On the fourth night, when I was beginning to feel knocked up, and tired of the same songs, the same quadrilles, the bad whisky, the suffocating tobacco smoke, and the morning's certain and desperate penalties, I remarked to Jemmy that it was a miracle how he had managed to weather it for so many years. What a hardship you would deem it, I added, if you were obliged to go the same weary round from one year's end to another. What did he say to that? Asked Philip. Why, I never saw him so taken aback. He looked quite fiercely at me and replied,
I am obliged.
How did he make that out? Why, he had tippled and dissipated his constitution into such a state that use had become second nature. Excitement was his natural condition, and he dared not become quite sober for fear of a total collapse, or dropping down like a shot in the water. The midshipman had his glass in his hand, but forbore to taste it. Well, what then? The rounds lasted 2 nights longer. I was fairly beaten. Cast iron could not have stood it. I was prostrated in bed with fever, and worse. Ferdinand was agitated, and took a large draught of his lemonade. Well, well, you need not enlarge upon that, replied Phil Fid, raising his glass towards his lips, but again thinking better of it. I heard how bad you were from Seaton, who shaved your head. I had scarcely recovered when the Arrow was ordered back, and I made a vow. Took the pledge, perhaps, interjected the mid, with a slight curl of his lip. No, I determined to work more and play less. We had a capital naval instructor aboard, and our commander was as good an officer as ever trod the deck. I studied, a little too hard, perhaps, for I was laid up again. The Arrow was, as usual, as good as her name, and we shot across to Jamaica in 5 weeks. One evening, as we were lying in Kingston Harbour, Seaton, who had come over to join the Commodore as full surgeon, told me what he had never ventured to divulge before. What was that? Why, that on the very day I left London, James Barber died of a frightful attack of delirium tremens. Poor Jemmy, said the elder Fid sorrowfully, taking a long pull of consolation from his rummer. Little did I think, while singing some of your best songs off Belem Castle, that I had seen you for the last time. I hadn't seen him for the last time, returned the lieutenant, with awful significance. Philip assumed a careless air, and said, Go on. We were ordered home in 1845, and paid off in January. I went to Portsmouth, was examined, and passed as lieutenant. This allusion to his brother's better condition made poor Philip look rather blank. On being confirmed at the Admiralty, continued Ferdinand, I had to give a dinner to the Arrows, which I did at the Salopian, Charing Cross. In the excess of my joy at promotion, my determination of temperance and avoidance of what is called society was swamped. I kept it up once more. I went the rounds, and accepted all the dinner, supper, and ball invitations I could get, invariably ending each morning in one of the old haunts of dissipation. Old associations with James Barber returned, and like causes produced similar effects. One morning, while maundering home, I began to feel the same wild confusion as had previously commenced my dreadful malady. Ah, a little touched in the top hamper. It was just daylight. Thinking to cool myself, I jumped into a wherry to get pulled down here to Greenwich. Of course you were not quite sober. Don't ask. I do not like even to allude to my sensations, for fear of recalling them. My brain seemed in a flame. The boat appeared to be going at the rate of 20 miles an hour. Fast as we were cleaving the current, I heard my name distinctly called out. I reconnoitred, but could see nobody. I looked over on one side of the gunwale, and while doing so, felt something touch me from the other. I felt a chill. I turned round and saw— Whom? Asked the midshipman, holding his breath. What seemed to be James Barber. Was he wet? As dry as you are. I summoned courage to speak. Hello, some mistake, I exclaimed.
Not at all,
was the reply.
I'm James Barber. Don't be frightened. I'm harmless.
But—
I know what you are going to say,
interrupted the intruder.
Seaton did not deceive you. I am only an occasional visitor up here.
This brought me up with a round turn, and I had sense enough to wish my friend would vanish as he came. "Where shall we land you?" I asked.
Oh, anywhere. It don't matter. I have got to be out every night and all night, and the nights are plaguey long just now.
I could not muster a word. "Third Fid," continued the voice, which now seemed about 50 fathoms deep, and fast as we were dropping down the stream, the boat gave a heel to starboard, as if she had been broadsided by a tremendous wave. "Third Fid, you recollect how I used to kill time? How I sang, drank, danced and supped all night long, and then slept and soda-watered it all day? You remember what a happy fellow I seemed? Fools like yourself thought I was so. But I say again, I wasn't," growled the voice, letting itself down a few fathoms deeper. "Often and often I would have given the world to have been a market gardener or a dealer in chickweed, while roaring, 'He is a jolly good fellow, and we won't go home till morning,' as I emerged with a group from some tavern into Covent Garden Market. But I'm punished fearfully for my sins now. What do you think I have got to do every night of my— Never mind. What do you think is now marked out as my dreadful punishment?" "Well, to walk the earth, I suppose," said I.
No.
"To paddle about in the Thames from sunset to sunrise?"
Worse. Ha ha!
His laugh sounded like the booming of a gong.
I only wish my doom was merely to be a mudlark. No, no, I'm condemned to rush about from one evening party and public house to another. At the former I am bound for a certain term on each night to dance all the quadrilles and a few of the polkas and waltzes with clumsy partners, and then I have to eat stale pastry and tough poultry before I am let off from that place. After, I am bound to go to some cellar or singing place to listen to Hail Smiling Morn, Mynheer Van Dunk, the monks of old, Happy Land, imitations of the London actors, and to hear a whole canto of dreary extempore verses. I must also smoke a dozen of cigars, knowing, as in my present condition I must know, what they are made of. The whole to end on each night with unlimited brandy, British, and water, and eternal intoxication. Oh, F.F., be warned. Take my advice. Keep up your resolution, and don't do it again. When afloat, drink nothing stronger than purser's tea. When on shore, be temperate in your pleasures. Don't turn night into day. Don't exchange wholesome amusements for rabid debauchery, robust health for disease, and— well, I won't mention it. When afloat, study your profession, and don't get cashiered and cold-shouldered as I was. Promise me. Nay, you must swear.
At this word I thought I heard a gurgling sound in the water.
If I can get 6 solemn pledges before the season's over, I'm only to go these horrid rounds during the meeting of Parliament. Will you swear?
Again urged the voice, with persuasive agony. I was just able to comply.
10,000 thanks,
were the next words I heard.
I'm off, for there is an awful pint of pale ale, a chop, and a glass of brandy and water overdue yet, and I must devour them at the Shades.
We were then close to London Bridge.
Don't let the waterman pull to shore. I can get there without troubling him.
I remember no more. When sensation returned, I was in bed, in this very house, a shade worse than I had been from the previous attack. "That," said Philip, who had left his tumbler untasted, "must have been when you had your head shaved for the second time." "Exactly so." "And you really believe it was jovial James' ghost?" inquired Fid, earnestly. "Would it be rational to doubt it?" Philip rose and paced the room in deep thought for several minutes. He cast 2 or 3 earnest looks at his brother, and a few longing ones at his glass. In the course of his cogitation he groaned out more than once an apostrophe to poor James Barber. At length he declared his mind was made up. "Third," he said, "I told you a while ago to throw your lemonade over the side of the ship. Don't. Souse out my grog instead." The lieutenant did as he was bid. "And now," said Fid the elder, "ring for soda-water, for one must drink something." Last year it was my own good fortune to sail with Mr. Philip Fid in the Bombottle, 74. He is not exactly a teetotaler, but he never drinks spirits, and will not touch wine unmixed with water, for fear of its interfering with his studies, at which he is, with the assistance of the naval instructor, who is also the chaplain, assiduous. He is our first mate, and the smartest officer in the ship. Seaton is our surgeon. One day, after a cheerful wardroom dinner, of which Fid was a guest, while we were at anchor in the Bay of Cadiz, the conversation happened to turn upon jovial Jemmy's apparition, which had become the best authenticated ghost story in Her Majesty's naval service. On that occasion Seaton undertook to explain the mystery upon medical principles. "The fact is," he said, "what the commander of the Arrow saw" (Ferdinand had by this time got commissioned in his old ship) "was a spectrum, produced by that morbid condition of the brain which is brought on by the immoderate use of stimulants, and by dissipation. We call it transient monomania. I could show you dozens of such ghosts in the books, if you only had the patience while I turned them up." Everybody declared that was unnecessary. We would take the doctor's word for it, though I feel convinced not a soul besides the chaplain and myself had one iota of his faith shaken in the real presence of jovial Jemmy's post-mortem appearance to Fid the younger. Ghost or no ghost, however, the story had had the effect of converting Philip Fid from one of the most intemperate and inattentive to one of the soberest and best of Her Majesty's officers. May his promotion be steady.
The Schoolboy's Story. The Schoolboy's Story. Being rather young at present, I am getting on in years, but still I am rather young, I have no particular adventures of my own to fall back upon. It wouldn't much interest anybody here, I suppose, to know what a screw the Reverend is, or what a griffin she is, or how they do stick it into parents, particularly hair-cutting and medical attendance. One of our fellows was charged in his half's account 12 and 6pence for 2 pills, tolerably profitable at 6 and 3pence apiece, I should think, and he never took them either, but put them up the sleeve of his jacket. As to the beef, it's shameful. It's not beef. Regular beef isn't veins. You can chew regular beef. Besides which, there's gravy to regular beef, and you never see a drop to ours. Another of our fellows went home ill, and heard the family doctor tell his father that he couldn't account for his complaint unless it was the beer. Of course it was the beer, and well it might be. However, beef and Old Cheeseman are 2 different things. So is beer. It was Old Cheeseman I meant to tell about, not the manner in which our fellows get their constitutions destroyed for the sake of profit. Why, look at the pie crust alone. There's no flakiness in it. It's solid, like damp lead. Then our fellows get nightmares, and are bolstered for calling out and waking other fellows. Who can wonder? Old Cheeseman one night walked in his sleep, put his hat on over his nightcap, got hold of a fishing rod and a cricket bat, and went down into the parlour, where they naturally thought from his appearance he was a ghost. Why, he never would have done that if his meals had been wholesome. When we all begin to walk in our sleeps, I suppose they'll be sorry for it. Old Cheeseman wasn't second Latin master then. He was a fellow himself. He was first brought there very small in a post-chaise by a woman who was always taking snuff and shaking him, and that was the most he remembered about it. He never went home for the holidays. His accounts, he never learnt any extras, were sent to a bank, and the bank paid them. And he had a brown suit twice a year, and went into boots at 12. They were always too big for him, too. In the midsummer holidays, some of our fellows who lived within walking distance used to come back and climb the trees outside the playground wall, on purpose to look at Old Cheeseman reading there by himself. He was always as mild as the tea, and that's pretty mild, I should hope. So when they whistled to him, he looked up and nodded. And when they said, "Hello, Old Cheeseman, what have you had for dinner?" he said, "Boiled mutton." And when they said, "Ain't it solitary, Old Cheeseman?" he said, "It is a little dull sometimes." And then they said, "Well, good-bye, Old Cheeseman," and climbed down again. Of course it was imposing on Old Cheeseman to give him nothing but boiled mutton through a whole vacation, but that was just like the system. When they didn't give him boiled mutton, they gave him rice pudding, pretending it was a treat, and saved the butcher. So Old Cheeseman went on. The holidays brought him into other trouble besides the loneliness. because when the fellows began to come back, not wanting to, he was always glad to see them, which was aggravating when they were not at all glad to see him, and so he got his head knocked against walls, and that was the way his nose bled. But he was a favourite in general. Once a subscription was raised for him, and to keep up his spirits he was presented before the holidays with 2 white mice, a rabbit, a pigeon, and a beautiful puppy. Old Cheeseman cried about it, especially soon afterwards, when they all ate one another. Of course Old Cheeseman used to be called by the names of all sorts of cheeses: Double Gloucesterman, Family Cheshireman, Dutchman, North Wiltshireman, and all that. But he never minded it, and I don't mean to say he was old in point of years, because he wasn't, only he was called from the first Old Cheeseman. At last Old Cheeseman was made second Latin master. He was brought in one morning at the beginning of a new half, and presented to the school in that capacity as Mr. Cheeseman. Then our fellows all agreed that Old Cheeseman was a spy and a deserter who had gone over to the enemy's camp and sold himself for gold. It was no excuse for him that he had sold himself for very little gold, £2.10 a quarter, and his washing, as was reported. It was decided by a Parliament which sat about it that Old Cheeseman's mercenary motives could alone be taken into account, and that he had coined our blood for drachmas. The Parliament took the expression out of the quarrel scene between Brutus and Cassius. When it was settled in this strong way that Old Cheeseman was a tremendous traitor who had wormed himself into our fellows' secrets on purpose to get himself into favour by giving up everything he knew, all courageous fellows were invited to come forward and enrol themselves in a society for making a set against him. The president of the society was first boy, named Bob Tarter. His father was in the West Indies, and he owned himself that his father was worth millions. He had great power among our fellows, and he wrote a parody beginning, "Who made believe to be so meek that we could hardly hear him speak, yet turned out an informing sneak, Old Cheeseman," and on in that way through more than a dozen verses, which he used to go and sing every morning close by the new master's desk. He trained one of the low boys, too, a rosy-cheeked little brass who didn't care what he did, to go up to him with his Latin grammar one morning and say it so: "Nominativus promonium, Old Cheeseman, rabo exprimitur," was never suspected, "nisi distinctionis," of being an informer, "aut emphasis gratia," until he proved one, ut, for instance, vos damnastis, when he sold the boys, quasi, as though, dicat, he should say, praetaria nemo, I'm a Judas. All this produced a great effect on Old Cheeseman. He had never had much hair, but what he had began to get thinner and thinner every day. He grew paler and more worn, and sometimes of an evening he was seen sitting at his desk with the precious long snuff to his candle, and his hands before his face, crying. But no member of the society could pity him, even if he felt inclined, because the president said it was Old Cheeseman's conscience. So Old Cheeseman went on, and didn't he lead a miserable life? Of course the Reverend turned up his nose at him, and of course she did, because both of them always do that at all the masters. But he suffered from the fellows most, and he suffered from them constantly. He never told about it, that the society could find out. But he got no credit for that, because the president said it was Old Cheeseman's cowardice. He had only one friend in the world, and that one was almost as powerless as he was, for it was only Jane. Jane was a sort of wardrobe woman to our fellows, and took care of the boxers. She had come at first, I believe, as a kind of apprentice. Some of our fellows say from a charity, but I don't know, and after her time was out, had stopped at so much a year. So little a year, perhaps I ought to say, for it is far more likely. However, she had put some pounds in the savings bank, and she was a very nice young woman. She was not quite pretty, but she had a very frank, honest, bright face, and all our fellows were fond of her. She was uncommonly neat and cheerful, and uncommonly comfortable and kind. And if anything was the matter with a fellow's mother, he always went and showed the letter to Jane. Jane was Old Cheeseman's friend. The more the society went against him, the more Jane stood by him. She used to give him a good-humoured look out of her still-room window sometimes that seemed to set him up for the day. She used to pass out of the orchard and the kitchen garden, always kept locked, I believe you, through the playground, when she might have gone the other way, only to give a turn of her head, as much as to say, "Keep up your spirits," to Old Cheeseman. His slip of a room was so fresh and orderly that it was well known who looked after it while he was at his desk, and when our fellows saw a smoking hot dumpling on his plate at dinner, they knew with indignation who had sent it up. Under these circumstances the society resolved, after a quantity of meeting and debating, that Jane should be requested to cut Old Cheeseman dead, and that if she refused she must be sent to Coventry herself. So a deputation, headed by the President, was appointed to wait on Jane, and inform her of the vote the society had been under the painful necessity of passing. She was very much respected for all her good qualities, and there was a story about her having once waylaid the Reverend in his own study, and got a fellow off from severe punishment of her own kind, comfortable heart. So the deputation didn't much like the job. However, they went up, and the President told Jane all about it, upon which Jane turned very red, burst into tears, informed the President and the deputation, in a way not at all like her usual way, that they were a parcel of malicious young savages, and turned the whole respected body out of the room. Consequently, it was entered in the Society's book, kept in astronomical cipher for fear of detection, that all communication with Jane was interdicted, and the President addressed the members on this convincing instance of Old Cheeseman's undermining. But Jane was as true to Old Cheeseman as Old Cheeseman was false to our fellows, in their opinion at all events, and steadily continued to be his only friend. It was a great exasperation to the society, because Jane was as much a loss to them as she was a gain to him, and being more inveterate against him than ever, they treated him worse than ever. At last, one morning, his desk stood empty, his room was peeped into and found to be vacant, and a whisper went about among the pale faces of our fellows that Old Cheeseman, unable to bear it any longer, had got up early and drowned himself. The mysterious looks of the other masters after breakfast, and the evident fact that Old Cheeseman was not expected, confirmed the society in this opinion. Some began to discuss whether the President was liable to hanging or only transportation for life, and the President's face showed a great anxiety to know which. However, he said that a jury of his country should find him game, and that in his address he should put it to them to lay their hands upon their hearts, and say whether they, as Britons, approved of informers, and how they thought they would like it themselves. Some of the society considered that he had better run away until he found a forest where he might change clothes with a woodcutter, and stain his face with blackberries. But the majority believed that if he stood his ground, his father, belonging as he did to the West Indies, and being worth millions, could buy him off. All our fellows' hearts beat fast when the Reverend came in, and made a sort of a Roman or a field marshal of himself with the ruler, as he always did before delivering an address. But their fears were nothing to their astonishment when he came out with the story that Old Cheeseman, "so long as our respected friend and fellow pilgrim in the pleasant plains of knowledge," he called him, oh yes, I dare say, much of that, was the orphan child of a disinherited young lady who had married against her father's wish, and whose young husband had died, and who had died of sorrow herself, and whose unfortunate baby, Old Cheeseman, had been brought up at the cost of a grandfather who would never consent to see it, baby, boy, or man, which grandfather was now dead, and serve him right, that's my putting in, and which grandfather's large property, there being no will, was now and all of a sudden and for ever Old Cheeseman's. Our so long respected friend and fellow pilgrim in the pleasant plains of knowledge, the Reverend wound up a lot of bothering quotations by saying would come among us once more that day fortnight, when he desired to take leave of us himself in a more particular manner. With these words he stared severely round at our fellows, and went solemnly out. There was precious consternation among the members of the society now. Lots of them wanted to resign, and lots more began to try to make out that they had never belonged to it. However, the President stuck up and said that they must stand or fall together, and that if a breach was made it should be over his body, which was meant to encourage the society, but it didn't. The President further said he would consider the position in which they stood, and would give them his best opinion and advice in a few days. This was eagerly looked for, as he knew a good deal of the world on account of his father's being in the West Indies. After days and days of hard thinking, and drawing armies all over his slate, the President called our fellows together and made the matter clear. He said it was plain that when Old Cheeseman came on the appointed day, his first revenge would be to impeach the society and have it flogged all round. After witnessing with joy the torture of his enemies, and gloating over the cries which agony would extort from them, the probability was that he would invite the Reverend, on pretence of conversation, into a private room, say the parlour, into which parents were shown, where the two great globes were, which were never used, and would there reproach him with the various frauds and oppressions he had endured at his hands. At the close of his observations he would make a signal to a prize-fighter concealed in the passage, who would then appear and pitch into the Reverend till he was left insensible. Old Cheeseman would then make Jane a present of from £5 to £10, and would leave the establishment in fiendish triumph. The President explained that against the parlour part, or the Jane part, of these arrangements he had nothing to say, but on the part of the society he counselled deadly resistance. With this view he recommended that all available desks should be filled with stones, and that the first word of the complaint should be the signal to every fellow to let fly at Old Cheeseman. The bold advice put the society in better spirits, and was unanimously taken. A post about Old Cheeseman's size was put up in the playground, and all our fellows practised at it till it was dinted all over. When the day came, and places were called, every fellow sat down in a tremble. There had been much discussing and disputing as to how Old Cheeseman would come, but it was the general opinion that he would appear in a sort of triumphal car, drawn by 4 horses, with 2 livery servants in front, and the prize-fighter in disguise up behind. So all our fellows sat listening for the sound of wheels. But no wheels were heard, for Old Cheeseman walked, after all, and came into the school without any preparation, pretty much as he used to be, only dressed in black. "Gentlemen," said the Reverend, presenting him, "our so long respected friend and fellow pilgrim in the pleasant plains of knowledge is desirous to offer a word or two. Attention, gentlemen, one and all." Every fellow stole his hand into his desk and looked at the President. The President was all ready, and taking aim at Old Cheeseman with his eyes. What did Old Cheeseman then but walk up to his old desk, look round him with a queer smile as if there was a tear in his eye, and begin in a quavering mild voice, "My dear companions and old friends." Every fellow's hand came out of his desk, and the President suddenly began to cry. "My dear companions and old friends," said Old Cheeseman, "you have heard of my good fortune. I have passed so many years under this roof, my entire life, so far, I may say, that I hope you have been glad to hear of it for my sake. I could never enjoy it without exchanging congratulations with you. If we have ever misunderstood one another at all, pray, my dear boys, let us forgive and forget. I have a great tenderness for you, and I am sure you return it. I want in the fullness of a grateful heart to shake hands with you every one. I have come back to do it, if you please, my dear boys." Since the President had begun to cry, several other fellows had broken out here and there, but now when Old Cheeseman began with him as first boy, laid his left hand affectionately on his shoulder and gave him his right, and when the President said, "Indeed, I don't deserve it, sir. Upon my honour, I don't," there was sobbing and crying all over the school. Every other fellow said he didn't deserve it, much in the same way, but Old Cheeseman, not minding that a bit, went cheerfully round to every boy, and wound up with every master, finishing off the Reverend last. Then a snivelling little chap in a corner, who was always under some punishment or other, set up a shrill cry of "Success to Old Cheeseman! Hooray!" The Reverend glared upon him and said, "Mr. Cheeseman, sir." But Old Cheeseman, protesting that he liked his old name a great deal better than his new one, all our fellows took up the cry, and for I don't know how many minutes There was such a thundering of feet and hands, and such a roaring of Old Cheeseman as never was heard. After that there was a spread in the dining-room of the most magnificent kind: fowls, tongues, preserves, fruits, confectionaries, jellies, neguses, barley-sugar temples, trifles, crackers, eat all you can and pocket what you like, all at Old Cheeseman's expense. After that, speeches, whole holiday, double and treble sets of all manners of things for all manners of games, donkeys, pony-chaises and drive yourself, dinner for all the masters at the Seven Bells, £20 a head our fellows estimated it at, an annual holiday and feast fixed for that day every year, and another on Old Cheeseman's birthday, Reverend bound down before the fellows to allow it, so that he could never back out, all at Old Cheeseman's expense. And didn't our fellows go down in a body and cheer outside the Seven Bells? Oh, no. But there's something else besides. Don't look at the next story-teller, for there's more yet. Next day it was resolved that the society should make it up with Jane, and then be dissolved. What do you think of Jane being gone, though? What? Gone for ever? Said our fellows with long faces. Yes, to be sure, was all the answer they could get. None of the people about the house would say anything more. At length the first boy took upon himself to ask the Reverend whether our old friend Jane was really gone. The Reverend, he has got a daughter at home, turn-up-nose and red, replied severely, "Yes, sir, Miss Pitt is gone." The idea of calling Jane Miss Pitt! Some said she had been sent away in disgrace for taking money from Old Cheeseman. Others said she had gone into Old Cheeseman's service at a rise of £10 a year. All that our fellows knew was, she was gone. It was 2 or 3 months afterwards when, one afternoon, an open carriage stopped at the cricket field just outside bounds, with a lady and gentleman in it, who looked at the game a long time and stood up to see it played. Nobody thought much about them until the same little snivelling chap came in against all rules from the post where he was scout and said, "It's Jane!" Both 11s forgot the game directly and ran crowding round the carriage. It was Jane, in such a bonnet! And if you believe me, Jane was married to Old Cheeseman. It soon became quite a regular thing, when our fellows were hard at it in the playground, to see a carriage at the low part of the wall where it joins the high part, and a lady and gentleman standing up in it looking over. The gentleman was always Old Cheeseman, and the lady was always Jane. The first time I ever saw them, I saw them in that way. There had been a good many changes among our fellows then, and it had turned out that Bob Tarter's father wasn't worth millions. He wasn't worth anything. Bob had gone for a soldier, and Old Cheeseman had purchased his discharge. But that's not the carriage. The carriage stopped, and all our fellows stopped as soon as it was seen. "So have you never sent me to Coventry after all?" said the lady, laughing, as our fellows swarmed up the wall to shake hands with her. "Are you never going to do it?" "Never, never, never!" on all sides. I didn't understand what she meant then, but of course I do now. I was very much pleased with her face, though, and with her good way, and I couldn't help looking at her, and at him too, with all our fellows clustering so joyfully about them. They soon took notice of me as a new boy, so I thought I might as well swarm up the wall myself and shake hands with them as the rest did. I was quite as glad to see them as the rest were, and was quite as familiar with them in a moment. "Only a fortnight now," said Old Cheeseman, "to the holidays. Who stops? Anybody?" A good many fingers pointed at me, and a good many voices cried, "He does," for it was the year when you were all away, and rather low I was about it, I can tell you. "Oh," said Old Cheeseman, "but it's solitary here in the holiday time. He had better come to us." So I went to their delightful house, and was as happy as I could possibly be. They understand how to conduct themselves towards boys, they do. When they take a boy to the play, for instance, they do take him. They don't go in after it's begun, or come out before it's over. They know how to bring a boy up, too. Look at their own. Though he is very little as yet, what a capital boy he is. Why, my next favourite to Mrs. Cheeseman and Old Cheeseman is young Cheeseman. So now I have told you all I know about Old Cheeseman, and it's not much after all, I'm afraid, is it?
Nobody's Story. He lived on the bank of a mighty river, broad and deep, which was always silently rolling on to a vast undiscovered ocean. It had rolled on ever since the world began. It had changed its course sometimes, and turned into new channels, leaving its old ways dry and barren, but it had ever been upon the flow, and ever was to flow until time should be no more. Against its strong, unfathomable stream nothing made head. No living creature, no flower, no leaf, no particle of animate or inanimate existence ever strayed back from the undiscovered ocean. The tide of the river set resistlessly towards it, and the tide never stopped, any more than the earth stops in its circling around the sun. He lived in a busy place, and he worked very hard to live. He had no hope of ever being rich enough to live a month without hard work, but he was quite content, God knows, to labour with a cheerful will. He was one of an immense family, all of whose sons and daughters gained their daily bread by daily work, prolonged from their rising up betimes until their lying down at night. Beyond this destiny he had no prospect, and he sought none. There was overmuch drumming, trumpeting, and speech-making in the neighbourhood where he dwelt, but he had nothing to do with that. Such clash and uproar came from the bigwig family, at the unaccountable proceedings of which race he marvelled much. They set up the strangest statues in iron, marble, bronze, and brass before his door, and darkened his house with the legs and tails of uncouth images of horses. He wondered what it all meant, smiled in a rough, good-humoured way he had, and kept at his hard work. The bigwig family, composed of all the stateliest people thereabouts, and all the noisiest, had undertaken to save him the trouble of thinking for himself, and to manage him and his affairs. "Why, truly," said he, "I have little time upon my hands, and if you will be so good as to take care of me, in return for the money I pay over," for the bigwig family were not above his money, "I shall be relieved and much obliged, considering that you know best." Hence the drumming, trumpeting, and speech-making, and the ugly images of horses, which he was expected to fall down and worship. "I don't understand all this," said he, rubbing his furrowed brow confusedly, "but it has a meaning, maybe, if I could find it out." "It means," returned the bigwig family, suspecting something of what he said, "honour and glory in the highest, to the highest merit." "Oh," said he, and he was glad to hear that. But when he looked among the images in iron, marble, bronze, and brass, he failed to find a rather meritorious countryman of his, once the son of a Warwickshire wool dealer, or any single countryman whomsoever of that kind. He could find none of the men whose knowledge had rescued him and his children from terrific and disfiguring disease, whose boldness had raised his forefathers from the condition of serfs, whose wise fancy had opened a new and high existence to the humblest, whose skill had filled the working man's world with accumulated wonders. Whereas he did find others whom he knew no good of, and even others whom he knew much ill of. "Humph," said he, "I don't quite understand it." So he went home and sat down by his fireside to get it out of his mind. Now his fireside was a bare one, all hemmed in by blackened streets, but it was a precious place to him. The hands of his wife were hardened with toil, and she was old before her time, but she was dear to him. His children, stunted in their growth, bore traces of unwholesome nurture, but they had beauty in his sight. Above all other things, it was an earnest desire of this man's soul that his children should be taught. "If I am sometimes misled," said he, "for want of knowledge, at least let them know better, and avoid my mistakes. If it is hard to me to reap the harvest of pleasure and instruction that is stored in books, let it be easier to them." But the bigwig family broke out into violent family quarrels concerning what it was lawful to teach to this man's children. Some of the family insisted on such a thing being primary and indispensable above all other things, and others of the family insisted on such another thing being primary and indispensable above all other things. And the bigwig family rent into factions, wrote pamphlets, held convocations, delivered charges, orations, and all variety of discourses, impounded one another in courts lay and courts ecclesiastical, threw dirt, exchanged pummelings, and fell together by the ears in unintelligible animosity. Meanwhile, this man, in his short evening snatches at his fireside, saw the demon Ignorance arise there, and take his children to itself. He saw his daughter perverted into a heavy, slatternly drudge. He saw his son go moping down the ways of low sensuality, to brutality and crime. He saw the dawning light of intelligence in the eyes of his babies, so changing into cunning and suspicion that he could have rather wished them idiots. "I don't understand this any better," said he, "but I think it cannot be right. Nay, by the clouded heaven above me, I protest against this as my wrong." Becoming peaceable again, for his passion was usually short-lived and his nature kind, he looked about him on his Sundays and holidays, and he saw how much monotony and weariness there was, and thence how drunkenness arose with all its train of ruin. Then he appealed to the bigwig family and said, "We are a labouring people, and I have a glimmering suspicion in me that labouring people of whatever condition were made by a higher intelligence than yours, as I poorly understand it, to be in need of mental refreshment and recreation. See what we fall into when we rest without it. Come, amuse me harmlessly, show me something, give me an escape." But here the bigwig family fell into a state of uproar absolutely deafening. When some few voices were faintly heard proposing to show him the wonders of the world, the greatness of creation, the mighty changes of time, the workings of nature, and the beauties of art, to show him these things, that is to say, at any period of his life when he could look upon them, there rose among the bigwigs such roaring and raving, such pulpiting and petitioning, such maunderings and memorializing, such name-calling and dirt-throwing, such a shrill wind of parliamentary questioning and feeble replying, where I dare not waited on, I would, that the poor fellow stood aghast, staring wildly around. "Have I provoked all this," said he, with his hands to his affrighted ears, "by what was meant to be an innocent request, plainly arising out of my familiar experience and the common knowledge of all men who choose to open their eyes? I don't understand, and I am not understood. What is to come of such a state of things?" He was bending over his work, often asking himself the question, when the news began to spread that a pestilence had appeared among the labourers, and was slaying them by thousands. Going forth to look about him, he soon found this to be true. The dying and the dead were mingled in the close and tainted houses among which his life was passed. New poison was distilled into the always murky, always sickening air. The robust and the weak, old age and infancy, the father and the mother, all were stricken down alike. What means of flight had he? He remained there, where he was, and saw those who were dearest to him die. A kind preacher came to him, and would have said some prayers to soften his heart in his gloom, but he replied, "Oh, what avails it, missionary, to come to me, a man condemned to residence in this fetid place, where every sense bestowed upon me for my delight becomes a torment, and where every minute of my numbered days is new mire added to the heap under which I lie oppressed? But give me my first glimpse of heaven, through a little of its light and air. Give me pure water. Help me to be clean. Lighten this heavy atmosphere and heavy life in which our spirits sink, and we become the indifferent and callous creatures you too often see us. Gently and kindly take the bodies of those who die among us out of the small room where we grow to be so familiar with the awful change that even its sanctity is lost to us. And, teacher, then I will hear, none knows better than you how willingly, of him whose thoughts were so much with the poor, and who had compassion for all human sorrow. He was at work again, solitary and sad, when his master came and stood near to him, dressed in black. He also had suffered heavily. His young wife, his beautiful and good young wife, was dead. So too his only child. Master, 'tis hard to bear, I know it, but be comforted. I would give you comfort if I could. The master thanked him from his heart, but said he, O you labouring men, the calamity began among you. If you had but lived more healthily and decently, I should not be the widowed and bereft mourner that I am this day. Master, returned the other, shaking his head, I have begun to understand a little that most calamities will come from us, as this one did, and that none will stop at our poor doors until we are united with that great squabbling family yonder to do the things that are right. We cannot live healthily and decently unless they who undertook to manage us provide the means. We cannot be instructed unless they will teach us. We cannot be rationally amused unless they will amuse us. We cannot but have some false gods of our own, while they set up so many of theirs in all the public places. The evil consequences of imperfect instruction, the evil consequences of pernicious neglect, the evil consequences of unnatural restraint and the denial of humanizing enjoyments, will all come from us, and none of them will stop with us. They will spread far and wide. They always do. They always have done, just like the pestilence. I understand so much, I think, at last. But the master said again, O you labouring men, how seldom do we ever hear of you, except in connection with some trouble. Master, he replied, I am nobody, and little likely to be heard of, nor yet much wanted to be heard of, perhaps, except when there is some trouble. But it never begins with me, and it never can end with me. As sure as death, it comes down to me, and it goes up from me. There was so much reason in what he said, that the bigwig family, getting wind of it, and being horribly frightened by the late desolation, resolved to unite with him to do the things that were right. At all events, so far as the said things were associated with the direct prevention, humanly speaking, of another pestilence. But as their fear wore off, which it soon began to do, they resumed their falling out among themselves, and did nothing. Consequently, the scourge appeared again, low down as before, and spread avengingly upward as before, and carried off vast numbers of the brawlers. But not a man among them ever admitted, if in the least degree he ever perceived, that he had anything to do with it. So nobody lived and died in the old way, and this, in the main, is the whole of Nobody's story. Had he no name, you ask? Perhaps it was Legion. It matters little what his name was. Let us call him Legion. If you were ever in the Belgian villages near the field of Waterloo, you will have seen, in some quiet little church, a monument erected by faithful companions in arms to the memory of Colonel A, Major B, Captains C, D, and E, Lieutenants F and G, Ensigns H, I, and J, 7 non-commissioned officers, and 130 rank and file who fell in the discharge of their duty on the memorable day. The story of nobody is the story of the rank and file of the earth. They bear their share of the battle, they have their part in the victory, they fall, they leave no name but in the mass. The march of the proudest of us leads to the dusty way by which they go. Oh, let us think of them this year at the Christmas fire, and not forget them when it is burnt out.
The Old Lady's Story. I have never told you my secret, my dear nieces. However, this Christmas, which may well be the last to an old woman, I will give the whole story. For though it is a strange story and a sad one, it is true. And what sin there was in it, I trust I may have expiated by my tears and my repentance. Perhaps the last expiation of all is this painful confession. We were very young at the time, Lucy and I, and the neighbors said we were pretty. So we were, I believe, though entirely different. For Lucy was quiet and fair, and I was full of life and spirits, wild beyond any power of control, and reckless. I was the elder by 2 years, but more fit to be in leading strings myself than to guide or govern my sister. But she was so good, so quiet, and so wise, that she needed no one's guidance, for if advice was to be given, it was she who gave it, not I, and I never knew her judgment or perception fail. She was the darling of the house. My mother had died soon after Lucy was born. A picture in the dining room of her, in spite of all the differences of dress, was exactly like Lucy. And as Lucy was now 17, and my mother had been only 18 when it was taken, there was no discrepancy of years. One All-Hallows Eve, a party of us, all young girls, not one of us 20 years of age, were trying our fortunes round the drawing-room fire, throwing nuts into the brightest blaze to hear if the mythic He's loved any of us, and in what proportion, or pouring hot lead into water to find cradles and rings, or purses and coffins, or breaking the whites of eggs into tumblers half full of water, then drawing up the white into pictures for the future. The prettiest experiment of all. I remember Lucy could only make a recumbent figure of hers, like a marble monument in miniature, and I a maze of masks and skulls and things that looked like dancing apes or imps, and vapory lines that did not require much imagination to fashion into ghosts or spirits, for they were clearly human in outline, but thin and vapory. And we all laughed a great deal and teased one another, and were as full of fun and mischief and innocence and thoughtlessness as a nest of young birds. There was a certain room at the other end of our rambling old manor house, which was said to be haunted, and which my father had therefore discontinued as a dwelling-room, so that we children might not be frightened by foolish servants. And he had made it into a lumber place, a kind of ground-floor granary where no one had any business. Well, it was proposed that one of us should go into this room alone, lock the door, stand before a glass, pare and eat an apple very deliberately, looking fixedly in the glass all the time, and then, if the mind never once wandered, the future husband would be clearly shown in the glass. As I was always a foolhardy girl of every party, and was, moreover, very desirous of seeing that apocryphal individual, my future husband, whose non-appearance I used to wonder at and bewail in secret, I was glad enough to make the trial, notwithstanding the entreaties of some of the more timid. Lucy, above all, clung to me, and besought me earnestly not to go, at last almost with tears. but my pride of courage, and my curiosity, and a certain nameless feeling of attraction were too strong for me. I laughed Lucy and her abettors into silence, uttered half a dozen bravados, and taking up a bedroom candle, passed through the long, silent passages to the cold, dark, deserted room, my heart beating with excitement, my foolish head dizzy with hope and faith. The church clock chimed 12:15 as I opened the door. It was an awful night. The windows shook as if every instant they would burst in with some strong man's hand on the bars and his shoulder against the frames. And the trees howled and shrieked as if each branch were sentient and in pain. The ivy beat against the window, sometimes with fury, and sometimes with the leaves slowly scraping against the glass and drawing out long, shrill sounds like spirits crying to each other. In the room itself it was worse. Rats had made refuge for many years, and they rushed behind the wainscot and down inside the walls, bringing with them showers of lime and dust, which rattled like chains, or sounded like men's feet hurrying to and fro. And every now and then a cry broke through the room. One could not tell from where or from what, but a cry, distinct and human. Heavy blows seemed to be struck on the floor, which cracked like parting ice beneath my feet, and loud knockings shook the walls. Yet in this tumult I was not afraid. I reasoned on each new sound very calmly and said, "Those are rats," or "Those are leaves," and birds in the chimney or owls in the ivy, as each new howl or scream struck my ear. And I was not in the least frightened or disturbed. It all seemed natural and familiar. I placed a candle on the table in the midst of the room, where an old broken mirror stood, and, looking steadily into the glass, having first wiped off the dust, I began to eat Eve's forbidden fruit, wishing intently, as I had been bidden, for the apparition of my future husband. In about 10 minutes, I heard a dull, vague, unearthly sound, felt, not heard. It was as if countless wings rushed by, and small, low voices whispering too, as if a crowd, a multitude of life was about me, as if shadowy faces crushed up against me, and eyes and hands and sneering lips all mocked me. I was suffocated. The air was so heavy, so filled with life, that I could not breathe. I was pressed on from all sides, and could not turn nor move without parting thickening vapors. I heard my own name. I can swear to that today. I heard it repeated through the room. And then bursts of laughter followed, and the wings rustled and fluttered, and the whispering voices mocked and chattered, and the heavy air, so filled with life, hung heavier and thicker, and the things that pressed up to me closer, and checked their breath on my lips with the clammy breath from theirs. I was not alarmed. I was not excited, but I was fascinated and spellbound, yet with every sense seeming to possess 10 times its natural power. I still went on looking in the glass, still earnestly desiring an apparition, when suddenly I saw a man's face peering over my shoulder in the glass. Girls, I could draw that face to this hour, the low forehead with the short curling hair, black as jet, growing down in a sharp point, the dark eyes beneath thick eyebrows burning with a peculiar light, the nose and the dilating nostrils, the thin lips curled into a smile. I see them all plainly before me now, and oh, the smile that it was, the mockery and sneer, the derision, the sarcasm, the contempt, the victory that were in it. Even then it struck into me a sense of submission. The eyes looked full into mine, those eyes and mine fastened on each other, And as I ended my task, the church clock chimed the half-hour. And suddenly released, as if from a spell, I turned round, expecting to see a living man standing beside me. But I met only the chill air coming in from the loose window, and the solitude of the dark night. The life had gone. The wings had rushed away. The voices had died out, and I was alone, with the rats behind the wainscot, the owls hooting in the ivy, and the wind howling through the trees. Convinced that either some trick had been played me, or that someone was concealed in the room, I searched every corner of it. I lifted lids of boxes filled with the dust of ages, and with rotting paper lying like bleaching skin. I took down the chimney board, and soot and ashes flew up in clouds. I opened dim old closets, where all manner of foul insects had made their homes, and where daylight had not entered for generations. But I found nothing. Satisfied that nothing human was in the room, and that no one could have been there tonight, nor for many months, if not years, and still nerved to a state of desperate courage, I went back to the drawing-room. But as I left that room, I felt that something flowed out with me, and all through the long passages I retained the sensation that this something was behind me. My steps were heavy, the consciousness of pursuit having paralyzed, not quickened me. For I knew that when I left that haunted room, I had not left it alone. As I opened the drawing-room door, the blazing fire and strong lamplight bursting out upon me with a peculiar expression of cheerfulness and welcome, I heard a laugh close at my elbow, and felt a hot blast across my neck. I started back, but the laugh died away, and all I saw were 2 points of light, fiery and flaming, that somehow fashioned themselves into eyes beneath their heavy brows, and looked at me meaningly through the darkness. They all wanted to know what I had seen, but I refused to say a word, not liking to tell a falsehood then, and not liking to expose myself to ridicule, for I felt that what I had seen was true, and that no sophistry and no argument, no reasoning and no ridicule could shake my belief in it. My sweet Lucy came up to me, seeing me look so pale and wild, threw her arms round my neck, and leaned forward to kiss me. As she bent her head, I felt the same warm blast rush over my lips, and my sister cried, "Why, Lizzie, your lips burn like fire!" And so they did, and for long after. The presence was with me still, never leaving me day or night. By my pillow, its whispering voice often waking me from wild dreams. By my side, in the broad sunlight. By my side in the still moonlight, never absent, busy at my brain, busy at my heart. A form ever banded to me. It flitted like a cold cloud between my sweet sister's eyes and mine, and dimmed them so that I could scarcely see their beauty. It drowned my father's voice, and his words fell confused and indistinct. Not long after, a stranger came into our neighborhood. He bought Green Howe, a deserted old property by the riverside, where no one had lived for many, many years, not since the young bride, Mrs. Braithwaite, had been found in the river one morning, entangled among the dank weeds and dripping alders, strangled and drowned, and her husband dead, none knew how, lying by the chapel door. The place had had a bad name ever since, and no one would live there. However, it was said that a stranger who had been long in the East, a Mr. Felix, had now bought it, and that he was coming to reside there. And, true enough, one day the whole of our little town of Thornhill was in a state of excitement, for a travelling carriage and four, followed by another full of servants, Hindus, or Lascars, or Negroes, dark-coloured, strange-looking people passed through, and Mr. Felix took possession of Green Howe. My father called on him after a time, and I, as the mistress of the house, went with him. Green Howe had been changed, as if by magic, and we both said so together as we entered the iron gates that led up to the broad walk. The ruined garden was one mass of plants, fresh and green, many of them quite new to me, and the shrubbery, which had been a wilderness, was restored to order. The house looked larger than before, now that it was so beautifully decorated, and the broken trellis work, which used to hang dangling among the ivy, was matted with creeping roses and jasmine, which left on me the impression of having been in flower, which was impossible. It was a fairy palace, and we could scarcely believe that this was the deserted, ill-omened Green Howe. The foreign servants, too, in Eastern dresses covered with rings and necklaces and earrings, the foreign smells of sandalwood and camphor and musk, the curtains that hung everywhere in place of doors, some of velvet and some of cloth of gold, the air of luxury such as I, a simple country girl, had never seen before, made such a powerful impression on me that I felt as if carried away to some unknown region. As we entered, Mr. Felix came to meet us, and drawing aside a heavy curtain that seemed all of gold and fire, for the flame-colored flowers danced and quivered on the gold, he led us into an inner room, where the darkened light, the atmosphere heavy with perfumes, the statues, the birds like living jewels, the magnificence of stuffs, and the luxuriousness of arrangement overpowered me. I felt as if I had sunk into a lethargy, in which I heard only the rich voice and saw only the fine form of our stranger host. He was certainly very handsome, tall, dark, yet pale as marble. His very lips were pale, with eyes that were extremely bright, but which had an expression behind them that subdued me. His manners were graceful. He was very cordial to us, and made us stay a long time, taking us through his grounds to see his improvements, and pointing out here and there further alterations to be made, all with such a disregard for local difficulties and for cost, that, had he been one of the princes of the genii, he could not have talked more royally. He was more than merely attentive to me, speaking to me often and in a lower voice, bending down near to me, and looking at me with eyes that thrilled through every nerve and fibre. I saw that my father was uneasy, and when we left, I asked him how he liked our new neighbor. He said, "Not much, Lizzie," with a grave and almost displeased look, as if he had probed the weakness I was scarcely conscious of myself. I thought at the time that he was harsh. However, as there was nothing positively to object to in Mr. Felix, my father's impulse of distrust could not well be indulged without rudeness, and my dear father was too thoroughly a gentleman ever to be rude even to his enemy. We therefore saw a great deal of the stranger, who established himself in our house on the most familiar footing, and forced on my father and Lucy an intimacy they both disliked, but could not avoid, for it was forced with such consummate skill and tact that there was nothing which the most rigid could object to. I gradually became an altered being under his influence. In one thing only a happier, in the loss of the voice and the form which had haunted me. Since I had known Felix, this terror had gone. The reality had absorbed the shadow. But in nothing else was this strange man's influence over me beneficial. I remember that I used to hate myself for my excessive irritability of temper when I was away from him. Everything at home displeased me. Everything seemed so small and mean and old and poor after the lordly glory of that house. And the very caresses of my family and olden schoolday friends were irksome and hateful to me. All except my Lucy lost its charm, and to her I was faithful as ever. To her I never changed, but her influence seemed to war with his, wonderfully. When with him I felt borne away in a torrent, his words fell upon me mysterious and thrilling, and he gave me fleeting glimpses into worlds which had never opened themselves to me before, glimpses seen and gone like the Arabian gardens. When I came back to my sweet sister, her pure eyes and the holy light that lay in them, her gentle voice speaking of the sacred things of heaven and the earnest things of life, seemed to me like a former existence, a state I had lived in years ago. But this divided influence nearly killed me. It seemed to part my very soul and wrench my being in twain. And this, more than all the rest, made me sad beyond anything people believed possible in one so gay and reckless as I had been. My father's dislike to Felix increased daily, and Lucy, who had never been known to use a harsh word in her life, from the first refused to believe a thought of good in him, or to allow him one single claim to praise. She used to cling to me in a wild, beseeching way, and entreat me with prayers, such as a mother might have poured out before an erring child, to stop in time, and to return to those who loved me. "For your soul is lost from among us, Lizzie," she used to say, "and nothing but a frame remains of the full life of love you once gave us." But one word, one look from Felix was enough to make me forget every ear and every prayer of her who, until now, had been my idol and my law. At last, my dear father commanded me not to see Felix again. I felt as if I should have died. In vain I wept and prayed. In vain I gave full license to my thoughts, and suffered words to pour from my lips which ought never to have crept into my heart. In vain. My father was inexorable. I was in the drawing-room. Suddenly, noiselessly, Felix was beside me. He had not entered by the door which was directly in front of me, and the window was closed. I never could understand this sudden appearance, for I am certain that he had not been concealed. "Your father has spoken of me, Lizzie," he said with a singular smile. I was silent. "And has forbidden you to see me again," he continued. "Yes," I answered, impelled to speak by something stronger than my will. "And you intend to obey him?" "No," I said again, in the same manner, as if I had been talking in a dream. He smiled again. Who was he so like when he smiled? I could not remember, and yet I knew that he was like someone I had seen, a face that hovered outside my memory, on the horizon, and never floated near enough to be distinctly realized. "You are right, Lizzie," he said then. "There are ties which are stronger than a father's commands, ties which no man has the right and no man has the power to break. Meet me tomorrow at noon in the Low Lane. We will speak further." He did not say this in any supplicating nor in any loving manner. It was simply a command, unaccompanied by one tender word or look. He had never said he loved me, never. It seemed to be too well understood between us to need assurances. I answered, "Yes," burying my face in my hands, in shame at this my first act of disobedience to my father. And when I raised my head, he was gone. Gone as he had entered, without a footfall sounding ever so lightly. I met him the next day, and it was not the only time that I did so. Day after day I stole at his command from the house, to walk with him in the low lane, the lane which the country people said was haunted, and which was consequently always deserted. And there we used to walk, or sit under the blighted elm tree for hours, he talking, but I not understanding all he said, for there was a tone of grandeur and of mystery in his words that overpowered without enlightening me, and that left my spirit dazzled rather than convinced. I had to give reasons at home for my long absences, and he bade me say that I had been with old Dame Todd, the blind widow of Thornhill Rise, and that I had been reading the Bible to her, and I obeyed, although while I said it, I felt Lucy's eyes fixed plaintively on mine, and heard her murmur a prayer that I might be forgiven. Lucy grew ill. As the flowers and the summer sun came on, her spirit faded more rapidly away. I have known since that it was grief more than a malady which was killing her. The look of nameless suffering, which used to be in her face, has haunted me through life with undying sorrow. It was suffering that I, who ought to have rather died for her, had caused. But not even her illness stayed me. In the intervals I nursed her tenderly and lovingly as before, but for hours and hours I left her, all through the long days of summer, to walk in the low lane and to sit in my world of poetry and fire. When I came back, my sister was often weeping, and I knew that it was for me. I, who once would have given my life to save her from 1 hour of sorrow. Then I would fling myself on my knees beside her in an agony of shame and repentance, and promise better things of the morrow, and vow strong efforts against the power and the spell that were on me. But the morrow subjected me to the same unhallowed fascination, the same faithlessness. At last Felix told me that I must come with him, that I must leave my home and take part in his life, that I belonged to him and to him only, and that I could not break the tablet of fate ordained, that I was his destiny and he mine, and that I must fulfill the law which the stars had written in the sky. I fought against this. I spoke of my father's anger and of my sister's illness. I prayed to him for pity, not to force this on me, and knelt in the shadows of the autumn sunset to ask him for forbearance. I did not yield to this day, nor the next, nor for many days. At last he conquered. When I said yes, he kissed the scarf I wore round my neck. Until then, he had never touched even my hand with his lips. I consented to leave my sister, who I well knew was dying. I consented to leave my father, whose whole life had been one act of love and care for his children, and to bring a stain on our name, unstained until then. I consented to leave those who loved me, all I loved, for a stranger. All was prepared. The hurrying clouds, lead-colored, and the howling wind, the fit companions in nature with the evil and the despair of my soul. Lucy was worse today. But though I felt going to my death and leaving her, I could not resist. Had his voice called me to the scaffold, I must have gone. It was the last day of October, and at midnight when I was to leave the house. I had kissed my sleeping sister, who was dreaming in her sleep, and cried and grasped my hand and called aloud, "Lizzie, Lizzie, come back!" But the spell was on me, and I left her. And still her dreaming voice called out, choking with sobs, "Not there, not there, Lizzie, come back to me." I was to leave the house by the large old haunted room that I have spoken of before. Felix waiting for me outside. And a little after 12 o'clock, I opened the door to pass through. This time, the chill and the damp and the darkness unnerved me. The broken mirror was in the middle of the room as before, and in passing it, I mechanically raised my eyes. Then I remembered that it was All Hallows' Eve, the anniversary of the apparition of last year. As I looked, the room which had been so deadly still became filled with the sound I had heard before. The rushing of large wings and the crowd of whispering voices flowed like a river around me, and again, glaring into my eyes, was the same face in the glass that I had seen before. The sneering smile even more triumphant, the blighting stare of the fiery eyes, the low brow and the coal-black hair, and the look of mockery, all were there, and all I had seen before and since, for it was Felix who was gazing at me from the glass. When I turned to speak to him, the room was empty. Not a living creature was there, only a low laugh and the far-off voices whispering, and the wings. And then a hand tapped on the window, and the voice of Felix cried from outside, "Come, Lizzie, come." I staggered rather than walked to the window, and as I was close to it, my hand raised to open it, there stood between me and it a pale figure clothed in white, her face more pale than the linen around it. Her hair hung down on her breast, and her blue eyes looked earnestly and mournfully into mine. She was silent, and yet it seemed as if a volume of love and of entreaty flowed from her lips, as if I heard words of deathless affection. It was Lucy, standing there in this bitter midnight cold, giving her life to save me. Felix called to me again impatiently, and as he called, the figure turned and beckoned me, beckoning me gently, lovingly, beseechingly, and then slowly faded away. The chime of the half-hour sounded, and I fled from the room to my sister. I found her lying dead on the floor, her hair hanging over her breast, and one hand stretched out as if in supplication. The next day, Felix disappeared. He and his whole retinue and Green Howe fell into ruins again. No one knew where he went, as no one knew whence he came. And to this day, I sometimes doubt whether or not he was a clever adventurer who had heard of my father's wealth, and who, seeing my weak and imaginative character, had acted on it for his own purposes. All that I do know is that my sister's spirit saved me from ruin, and that she died to save me. She had seen and known all, and gave herself for my salvation down to the last and supreme effort she made to rescue me. She died at that hour of 12:30, and at 12:30, as I live before you all, she appeared to me and recalled me. And this is the reason why I never married, and why I pass All Hallows' Eve in prayer by my sister's grave. I have told you tonight this story of mine, because I feel that I shall not live over another last night of October, but that before the next white Christmas roses come out like winter stars on the earth, I shall lie in peace in the grave. Not in the grave. Let me rather hope with my blessed sister in heaven.